I was surprised to see, I can say in COVID, I saw examples for this happening. You would be surprised to see how people on GitHub from different countries share data, even if it's medical, they find a way to, without identifying, but they share data on things that in early stages that you wouldn't believe. So researchers in one country, we talked to the Broad Institute in Massachusetts, was able to study things about Korea and Italy that they didn't even think of, but it's because they said, okay, let's think completely open. Not just think about the data that we have and what we know. Let's think about the world right now.
I'm Ron Jor, and this is Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. In each episode, I talk to someone who's trying to change our lives for the better in some meaningful way, whether through a new product, new venture, or a new way of looking at the world. And I try to understand how they came to it, what makes them tick, and what we can learn from them. Today I'm talking to Dr. Hila Lifshitz-Assaf. Hila is an associate professor at NYU Stern. She is also faculty associate at Harvard's Lab for Innovation Science. Her work received the prestigious Inspire grant from the National Science Foundation and has been recognized to have a strong impact on industry. It's also been taught at a variety of institutions around the world, including MIT, Harvard, Stanford, Wharton, London Business School, Columbia, and Carnegie Mellon. Hila spent 3 years at NASA studying their adoption of open innovation processes, which led to many insights in an award-winning dissertation and paper. She continues to investigate new innovation processes such as crowdsourcing, open source, open online innovation communities, Wikipedia, hackathons, makeathons, etc. In this conversation, we discuss how her childhood experience instilled in her a sincere curiosity towards everyday things and the freedom to explore them. How her journey through law, business, and strategic consulting revealed the limitations that they imposed, her 3-year research project at NASA, and what it was like to be a fly on the wall in the offices and meeting places of NASA, and what she learned from observing how they implemented open innovation. What we know about effective management for innovation and creativity, and what we can learn from hackathons, makeathons, and different innovation processes for large organizations, and how all of this is affected by COVID and the need to work remotely. So let's jump right in with Dr. Hila Lifshitz-Assaf. I'm sitting here across the screen from Dr. Hila Lifshitz-Assaf. Hila, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Great. I'll start, as I usually start these days, with just checking in to see how you're doing during COVID and just in general. There's always some unpleasant news, so just checking in how you're doing, to see how you're doing.
Thank you. I'm doing well, luckily. It's crazy times. Every day has its own news. I would say that it's for an academic and a researcher like me on the stuff that I work, on one hand, it's a fascinating time, and I feel like there's so many things I should be doing and both studying but trying also to help, and maybe I should do this or that. And on the other hand, then you feel you're so like, oh, this thing is now a mutation. And every time you think maybe you can help with this, maybe you can try with this, it surprises you. So I think it's an interesting situation to be in, to try to think as an academic, what is my role? Should I help? What are we doing as academics? What type of knowledge are we producing? Is it helpful? Is it not? When is it helpful? To whom? And teaching is different, of course. I'm teaching remotely. It was a big transition for me. Initially, like my students, I was also a bit disheartened by the fact that I will not be in class with them. And I like to teach and feel the students and the flow of things. But now I enjoy the remote teaching. It's not the same, but I enjoy it now. And I feel I know my students really well. And we have developed connections. And I've done a lot of one-on-ones with them, even with Zoom, and not just like the whole class. So I find a way to still feel that it's meaningful teaching. So I would say for me, it's like on the research, on the teaching, it required a lot of transformation this period.
I noticed that because you're studying management and the works of teams, you were trying to put out some more stuff on remote work and how to do it right. And is that kind of a way to feel like you're contributing at this time, or?
So The thing that I was contributing to, I would say, if at all, like we're all small, of course, in this big fight against COVID, but was actually on hackathons, and I participated and led and mentored a lot of teams from February, like from the beginning of COVID eruption, basically, all the big hackathons, especially one that I'm still involved with is the EU versus virus. It was a huge 20,000 participants hackathon, out of which came out 27 new startups working for COVID, and they still are running, and there is a lot of support. So I would say that was my part, that I tried to implement what I studied about hackathons and how we can accelerate innovation in this period when acceleration is needed. So that's the knowledge I was trying to contribute. The remote part was basically my experience with these teams. So it's not something that I officially yet studied. It's developed in these months where I was guiding and mentoring, and I could see the challenges. Also in my teaching, I teach, and the students have a project on a real company to devise a new strategy, and it's remote teamwork. So through my teaching, but mostly through the hackathon mentorship, I would say, experience, I've been trying to think, how can we help? Even hackathons and accelerated innovation is hard to begin with in the regular in-person reality, and then on online it's much harder. So that's what I've been trying to help with.
Does anything come to mind in terms of these COVID projects that is really inspiring to you, or do you think is actually would make an impact?
Yeah, there is one that I am planning to also, and I have been studying deeper, and I'm planning to write about, because I found it really intriguing. And it was the ventilator shortage in the US and the ventilator development, basically all the different initiatives, both hackathons and crowdsourcing platforms, and big hospitals and organizations that are the traditional organizations, not like a new makerspace that, of course, it's natural for them to try to come up with a new 3D printed ventilator. But like big hospitals, one of the hospitals we talked to and interviewed in our study was Mass General Hospital. It's like one of the leading hospitals in Boston and in the US. And they decided, and the physicians there decided to initiate, instead of the traditional model of just themselves with some companies, they had themselves and companies, but instead of trying to invent it all themselves, they open it to the crowd, they open it to anyone to innovate together, but in a very speedy, accelerated, different format. So this is something that I'm still looking into. We are in touch with them because some of them are now moving to manufacturing. And it's something that is worth, if you want, we can talk about it more in detail, but it's really worth, I think, looking into how can companies, organizations really try to use the new tools that we have, especially now that we are all remote, and to open their innovation to speed it up, because that's what we need.
Yeah. And we'll definitely talk more about these systems of innovation that you've studied. Any lesson from this one particular project that you think is something that kind of stayed with you?
Definitely. Yeah, it's I call it now. So what I realized is that I try to compare how is what they're doing now different from what I know from the last 10 years I've been studying open innovation and crowdsourcing. So how is that different? Is different. And I saw that it was different in the fact that they tried to think about all the things that usually happen after innovation. In the sense, innovation has these two very distinct and almost contradicting parts. The first part is the creative, the fun part, the juices, all the way to prototyping, let's say. And the second part, which some people call product typing, because it's manufacturing, legal, procurement, supply chain. It's like some people may call the boring part, others can say it's the efficiency, right? It's the well-oiled machine part. These two parts usually very separate. But in these times, because they realized it's not just about a great idea or a great prototype, I got to get all the way to manufacturing. There are people that need the ventilator. They did something different, and they brought a lot of the elements from the second part of the manufacturing to the first part. So they mixed it up. So I tried to think like, how do I even call it? This is something different that I haven't seen in studying innovation processes for all these years. And I even thought, okay, is it maybe like you flip something, but it's not completely flipping, because you can start completely with the end. So I call it today end starting innovation, because they did bring some things from the end to the start. And I'm looking at which element did they infuse? How did they infuse, let's say, the legal requirements into the creative part without ruining it? Because you don't want to think about legal first thing that you're trying to ideate.
Right.
But so they did it, let's say, in these tacit ways. The documents that the teams worked on were already the type of documents that they could then quickly submit to the FDA or to any improvement that they wanted. So it wasn't like killing the creativity by enforcing all these efficiency parts, but they did infuse it in interesting new ways. So indeed, that end starting innovation process is something that I find interesting and could be relevant beyond COVID to accelerate innovation, when it's really about, I need to get it manufactured fast, not just ideated fast.
Yeah. No, that's wonderful. And in this case, part of the problem that you need to solve, right? So it's very organic where you tackle that stuff. That's fascinating. And COVID makes me think, and we'll get into the kind of normal podcast beat in a second, but the power of a crisis, like certain things are so hard or impossible to change in ordinary times, but once there is a crisis, suddenly everybody's working from home. It's fine. It turns out it wasn't such a big deal after all, right? And I just saw in the big daily newspaper in Israel, 40% of Israelis said they're not coming back for a full week, or even more. 50% said we're not going back to the office for a full week, and I'll quit if you try to make me, right? It's the power of a real crisis, right, in producing change.
Yeah, unfortunately, many times change is awaiting a need, right? Like it cannot just happen. So I've been teaching digital strategy for years, for instance. And we've been talking to different companies and organizations. And I always do it with companies and organizations because I'm a field researcher. So I believe both in research and in teaching, even in bringing the field, combining the insights from the field with academic knowledge. So I bring a lot of different field experts, and I do live cases with these different companies. And it's amazing to see. So a lot of those things that people that were saying we should be more digitized as a company, we should have a digital strategy for years. Now they don't have a choice. Now it's, okay, like this industry has to change. This company has to change. So in that sense, it is an incentive and a driver for change. On what you said on the remote work, I think it's a pendulum, and we are not yet in a position to see where it's landing. Like, I think we have moved from one extreme of people being in the office, wasting a lot of time on other things, to another extreme of being people at home, locked down, isolated. It is maybe more productive, but it's not necessarily the most thing that is the best thing for creativity, right? So it's maybe more productive, but depends for what type of task. Collaboration, a lot of interpersonal relationships are disappearing at work, even I'm talking about in companies. So for a while it's working. I'm not sure it can work in a sustained way. This way, I do think there are hybrids, and that's where we will go. I don't think there is any reason to go all the way there or all the way to where we are now. But different hybrids and different combinations, even for different projects. It could be that on one project you will not need, because it's a team that you've been working with for 10 years, you won't need to meet them, or you will like to meet them because you get the rhythm of working in person differently. And on another project, people will prefer to work differently. So I think it's much more nuanced than like this black and white thing that we have today.
Interesting. Yeah, and maybe you will have time to get back to those hybrids and what you think about them.
Yeah, especially in the stuff that you're doing, for instance, a design sprint, right? Some parts of it, you can imagine that some parts of it really require the in-person, everyone together in a room, brainstorming, working fast. Others, not necessarily. You don't necessarily need to have them in the room. Even you want the isolation. You want every person to think differently, to think alone, to leverage the time zone difference. All of a sudden became something you can leverage. Right? Yeah. When you have team members all over the world and they work remotely. So it creates interesting new dynamics, but I don't think we know yet what they are. Like, what's the right formula? We're just experimenting.
For sure. And yeah, it's been a big experiment for us. And we've had a purely in-person, a purely remote, and then purely different hybrid models that we tried. And and for us too, we've been learning a lot from this crisis, right? Like the things that we used to fly anywhere, like we never used to do remote. Cool. So now I want to maybe take a step back, and this is something that I always do in the beginning, is I try to find a pattern, a long-lasting pattern with the guest. And so my question for you is, what's something that you've believed or held since childhood that still guides you today and still is still active in your life today? And if you need a second to think about it, take your time.
I think it's curiosity.
Mm.
Curiosity that leads to growth, to discovery, to self-development. But it's curiosity is a driving force. I think.
And how did that express itself when you were a kid? How do you think that developed? How did it get started?
Yeah. To be honest, I think it's my mother. Like, I was the first kid in my family, and she was my everything for all the first years that I was alone, me and her. In the first few years, somewhere in a university campus in the United States. But even later in life, she always introduced me to all these different things, and never for a second I realized that they could be really contradicting or different or juxtaposing, or things that people don't get exposed in the same time, or people think about them differently. So to me, they all seem fascinating. For instance, classic music, and then in the same time, like the coolest, I don't know, hip hop or whichever song there is today, that the most funny pop and nonsense but with classic music, like not making a distinction that this is like very important and serious and this is pop. Art and business. My mother is a very sophisticated negotiator, business person. And she's an artist. Like, she paints, she sculptures, like she has these amazing hands. And I never thought there's either or. Like, only growing up, I understood it's weird or it's rare to have both, like to be able to do both, to sit on contracts in real estate, and then in the morning to create a sculpture and to talk to me about like the movement of the sculpture and the hands. Like, so I always thought that's just, so it's created a lot of curiosity, and she inspired me in that sense to think that everything is interesting, because like it could be an idea for a sculpture, but it could also be the way that this grocery man is like running its shop, right? If we would go on the street, we could analyze this, and in the same way we could analyze the movement of the wind on the leaves, and would it be a cool sculpture or not? So there was something around everything is interesting and there is more to learn, and always like pursuing the next thing that you don't know. So she would always go to enrichment classes and share with me her notebooks and like whatever she would learn. Even after we would go to sleep, she would go to like Open University, what used to be Zoom. And before Zoom, they had all these like ways of studying remotely. So I think it's that drive that she's always curious. And even today, like recently, a few years ago, we went for a trip together, and I was amazed to see that even when we go and explore a new city, she is still that curious person that she wants to know, like, how do they call it in that language, and what's exactly do they eat in this culture, and so I think that just curiosity drive is something that I got from her. For my father, it was more around international trips. He was like going to China when it was still closed, and we always had like a big globe and a big map, and he would talk to me about all the capitals in days where memorizing all the capitals of the world was important. So I think from him I got the traveling bug, I would say, and like curiosity about the world. But for my mom, more the like intellectual curiosity. And then later on, I think it made sense to me that like studying, asking questions, learning what I don't know and always looking for what I don't know, it makes sense. I never tried to stay in one thing for too long until I got to academia, almost like until 10 years ago. And I'm already in my 40s. So it took me like many years. I would jump from one thing to another. Every year I would feel, okay, I got this. What's next? Like, I was always curious about the next thing. And I didn't feel it's wrong or it's weird, because I just thought that's what you do. That's how like you learn. That's how you grow in life. You just keep on exploring and you move from one thing to the other. Yeah.
So there's this, from what I'm hearing, kind of reading between the lines, is everything is interesting if you look closely and you try to understand what's behind it and what's the dynamic and try to dive deeper in. So how did that express itself? So before you got into academia, it sounds like you had a pretty interesting journey. What was that about?
Yeah. So I did law school and management. And I really enjoyed a lot of the way law school training helps you think in this really like interesting way, and you think about the big questions. So I went to antitrust authority back then in Israel, which was a relatively creative legal profession. But even then, I realized it's not creative enough, because in law, you always have to justify whatever you think by the past. So you always have to say this and that said this, and because of that precedent, we can say that. And I felt, I'm bound by the past. It's almost like I can't move forward when I write. It's like most of it has to be like what other people wrote. I want to say what I think a little bit, or try to understand it more. And because I learned both that and the management, and I could see that in management, people are asking same questions, let's say about the merger. A lot of mergers and acquisitions of company back then, also still today, is one of the biggest questions for strategy. And like the consultants that would advise those companies to do it or not, just said what they think. Like they analyzed the market like the same way that we had to do, but they didn't have to justify themselves with like a zillion years of law. And I said, okay, I want to try that. That seems more interesting. So I moved to strategy consulting, using a lot of those analytical tools that I learned, and the broad, I would say, management training, because it's very broad in undergrad. You get a taste of everything. And then I enjoyed strategy consulting for a while. But then when I went to companies, and I could see that after we leave, it doesn't necessarily mean that whatever we said is going to happen. Like I realized that, okay, the one interesting part is the intellectual part. But then I was curious, okay, what's going to happen with all these recommendations? And do they really implement those changes? And what's happening? And I could see that, for instance, we would do a lot of those innovation, creativity type of workshops, all these things. And 3 months later, great ideas came out, and there was a lot of excitement in the end of the workshop. 3 months later, I would talk to someone from the company. Did anything happen? No, this happened. And I was like, wait a minute. So all this power and energy that I'm investing in something, what does it make? Is there any impact? Does it make any change? So then I said, I want to go into these companies, and there are strategy positions inside companies. So that's what I did for a while in the mobile industry first, and then in the banking industry later. And then I could really see that a lot of these intellectual stuff are not really the ones that making the change in the end of the day. It's way more complex and nuanced. It's a lot about people and the way they're working, and the way politics, the way they're thinking, the team dynamics, like power dynamics. It's way more complex than where I started. So I started with this like very macro analysis, the market, the dynamics, M&As, mergers and acquisitions. And then I was like, wait a minute, it's a lot about people. For instance, we had this one in one of the companies, I won't mention the name, like the vice president would just not help each other to a disgusting degree. And it's all about these power struggles. And I said, okay, let's try on them all the theories and everything that I know. And we tried every time. Like we would change their incentive structure. We would give them, your annual bonus would be dependent on the performance of the other division. Let's see if now it changes. Nope. And let's try these. And nope. And then I realized, wow, I got to really spend more time in understanding people and how they work and how they think. And that led me a little bit to, I would say, move away from the field level and the industry level into understanding people, talking to people, like listening to them, interviewing them inside the company. So we would be like under the CEO, but I would spend time with the different people, like on each project that I would do, and talk to them and listen to them and just spend some time with them to really understand the work from their perspective. And only then I would bring recommendations to top management, not in the classic, let's say the McKinsey way, which is just analyze, say what you think. For instance, I had a big debate about it with one of my colleagues who came from McKinsey and said, do it the McKinsey way, just like start with the titles. And so literally, like that back then at least, that's how they teach. It's like, they would start with the titles of the slides, assuming that this is what's going to happen. Like you don't talk to the people that let's say you're doing a research project, like an internal consulting project on how you can improve AI in sales. So before you talk to the salespeople, say what, like they would suggest to you to say what you think and write all the titles of your potential slides that you would recommend to top management, and then go check if you're right. I was like, are you kidding me? First I got to talk to people, see what they think, like then think. And it took me years to understand that these debates are meaningful. And like in academia, there are people that are both camps. Some people just start with their model and their theory. And others, which I am on that camp, do field research, which is go to the field, see what's happening, listen, interact, try to understand, try to think what is, and then go to your theories and think what is new here, what is not. So it's a different mode. So that got me, I would say, to be more curious and to really understand people, their work processes, how they think. And at the end of those few years, there was a pivotal moment when the CEO of the bank that I was in the strategy consulting unit said, everyone is talking about innovation. But do we really have an innovation strategy? Like, can we have? We're just putting it on our logos and in our branding, but like, how do we manage for innovation? That's almost like a conundrum, like a puzzle by itself. Or can you even, it's this serendipitous...
Like a koan.
Yeah, exactly.
Like it's a contradictory thing.
Exactly, and a similar, like, how do you do it? And that got me intrigued. And I've been intrigued in I would say, on that puzzle ever since. It's been like many years, but I really think that's like the puzzle that I said, okay. And luckily, the head of that unit was managing with these like open principles before there were even a thing. And he said, anyone wants to work on this project, like the CEO just said. I was like, yeah, I want to work it. And then I started like looking online and reading all the big innovation theories and innovation. Back then it was Clay Christensen, disruption and disruptive innovation, and like trying to understand, is it something that a company or an organization can really plan for, can really prepare itself for? How do you really make sure you remain innovative? Because most organizations start very innovative if they are leading, let's say, in their industry, but it goes away after a while. So how do you maintain it? Can you even how do you plan for magic to happen? That's very hard. That's basically, I would say, what got me. And that is the only puzzle that I feel satisfied my curiosity, because it's almost an unanswered one. So I've been in the same thing. And that's what I said, that for years, I couldn't find anything that would satisfy my curiosity, and I would change every few years. That's, I would say, the big puzzle that I've been studying and researching and lecturing and consulting and everything, like ever since, because it's just... there is so much to it, I feel. There's so much to study and so much to understand and so much depth into it.
Yeah. In a way, it's like the big question, right? Both in business, but almost in bigger than that. Like, how do you maintain what you have and also renew yourself and change yourself?
I think people are feeling it today, because like many people get bored with themselves almost by being isolated and locked down, and the need for creativity, but it's not going to dawn on you because you're like at home. Like, it's not that someone is going to take you, come, let's do this creative task together. Like, you have to think, wait a minute, whichever age or stage of life you are, like, how can I change the way I think? How can I solve my problems in a new and a creative way? And how can I sustain it, or how can I do it? And it's not easy. Not from a cognitive perspective, not from an emotional perspective, not from a behavioral perspective. You have to change the way you do things. We're creatures of habit. It's fascinating. And then that's for one individual. And then you take a lot of individuals together and you put them in a team, and then you make an organization, and different people have to talk to each other and still do these things creatively. And I think it's interesting, especially with all the technologies you have today. So my specialty around creativity and innovation over the years has been around the digital transformation, if we want to call it, and all the new technologies that we have in the 21st century. How are they changing the way we can be more creative and innovative? So, because a lot has been written and we have a lot of theories on creativity and innovation, but less so around using new technologies to make it happen. So that's what I've been mostly focusing on and finding really interesting.
Cool. You had this famous study at NASA. And so NASA is a classically innovative place, or at least considered to be very innovative and at least cutting edge in one industry. And so I'd love to hear more about that. And then maybe before we go into the details of the experiment, what was it like to work with a company like NASA? We've all seen movies, but what was it like to actually step in there and paint a picture of the place?
Yeah, it was a dream come true to begin with. It was truly a childhood dream of mine as a kid, to be an astronaut, to understand space. So I was talking about that curiosity. In high school, I studied astrophysics and physics. But at some point in life, I realized it's not realistic. When I went to undergrad and all of this, I said, okay, like all these people that do this, in the end, they end up building a lot of I don't know, military technology or things that are not really, it's not that if I'll study it, I'll become an astronaut. So that dream, I would say, was silenced in my 20s. And then in my 30s, when I came to academia and I wanted to study innovation, then I told myself, okay, if I had the choice of choosing any organization in the world to choose how they're innovating and doing anything new, because I knew I wanted to do field research and work with organization, who would I choose? And I had a list of top 3, and they were one of the top 3. And then in a weird social gathering, there was this guy with a cool camera speaking about that curiosity and everything. And we started talking about the camera and how it takes pictures. And I was like, can you show me this? Can you show me that? Long story short, he started telling me about this MBA project that he's doing with NASA. And I was like, you're seriously doing something with NASA? Like, who's the professor? How can I get in touch? And that's how, and then I basically nagged that professor, who later became one of my advisors, until I was able to get in. My PhD was at Harvard Business School, so that's not just because of my curiosity that I was able to get in. It is something very important that when you're coming from such an institution, they respect it and they assume that even though they don't understand what a PhD in management is, because they think it's weird to do a PhD in management, they assume, okay, if you're coming from Harvard Business School, it's got to mean that you have some knowledge, and they give you the credit of doing something valuable. So they open the doors, I would say, more easily than if I would just be myself. They would not just, I'm a student that I want to study. It doesn't work like
that.
On a podcast.
No.
That doesn't work this way. But they are very open to a degree, because they literally hosted me there for 2 years. Like, I came to Johnson Space Center, to NASA Space Life Science Directorate, and people let me into their labs and let me shadow them and join their meetings. So it's not something that is commonly done. And so on one hand, it's that dream come true. On the other hand, I can tell you that after 3 months, I got cold feet. And I said, okay, this is fascinating. Now I've experienced it. I've done it. I can't understand a word they're saying. I don't know, like, I understand English, but this is rocket science. This is different. Like, it's going to take me years, because all my consulting and M&A and all of this, I've done consumer product, I've done banking, I've done mobile industry. I don't understand any of the science and the technology they're talking about. How will I even be able to understand? I want to listen to them, but I don't understand what they're talking about. So even if I listen carefully, it doesn't make sense to me. So it was a big decision of whether to continue that project or not, because that meant I have to invest a lot in really becoming close to them and really being able to understand whether the specific new ways of doing innovation that we were studying, open innovation, are going to be impactful or not, or how they're making a change. So I remember both the, wow, my dream is coming true moments in the beginning, but then also after a while, okay, let's see if maybe Procter & Gamble or, General Mills, or any company that I can understand their meetings is also interested in me doing research with. So it took a while to gain the ability and the confidence, and to spend more time there to be able to really understand all the different labs.
Sometimes you need one friend who can translate like a new language for you.
It doesn't work like that. No, because I had 11 different labs. Each of them is like a completely different world that I was studying. And they don't understand what is understandable or not. Like, for them, that's their language. Like, they can't see through it almost. So there was no one. So I did join their summer interns program, where they give you all these kind of, a lot of them are trying to explain to the interns. So that was helpful. But to be able to understand the day-to-day meeting, I had to spend almost a year just to really understand what's going on, to read their articles, to completely go local in that sense. Like, I would wake up in the morning getting the same email that everyone there got, like the NASA news in the morning, and I would go to sleep looking and reading the stuff that they read. So for a while, this is what I did, but I would go back and forth this was Texas, and my PhD was in Boston, and I lived there. So I would go back and forth, and that really helped me, because every time, otherwise I would not complete, I think, the PhD. I would just be so fascinated by what they do. I would just want to stay with NASA. I wouldn't want to write about it. So every time I would go back to HBS, then I would think, okay, what's actually new here theoretically? That's movement that I told you about, listening to people, but then thinking, okay, is this new? Is that different? Is this surprising theoretically? Like what do we know from an academic research perspective, like about this? Because some of the things that you can find interesting as a person are not interesting theoretically, right? So a lot of the knowledge and a lot of the things that I learned, I'm never going to write about because they're not new or they're not relevant to knowledge, to management theories. But some were. And to be able to tease apart, it takes a lot of time.
Interesting. So before we dive into what you actually found out I'm trying to satisfy childhood curiosity about. So
your
what
own?
is
You mean?
my own?
Okay, cool.
And maybe other people. But what is it like? Okay, so what is the culture like? Is it, because I could imagine it being, the things that I would compare it to is either academia or like a company like Google or some with a heavy engineering culture. Is it different? What is the culture like? What are like? Give me some color on like any memorable experiences where you were like, oh, only NASA would something like this happen.
Definitely. So I think it's really a unique culture and it's very local. So for instance, NASA's space life science is very different than the robotics. And like every space center, there are 10 space centers for NASA. People sometimes think about it as one organization, but let's say Ames Space Centers, it has nothing to do with the culture of Johnson. Like it's completely different. Right. So I would say every space center, because it's more engineering or less, has its own culture. But to paint a picture, it is very technology, geeky, fun-like in that sense. It's not like academic, as at least the part that I've been in. There are space centers that maybe are more academically oriented. But at Johnson Space Center, I took a picture, for instance, of one lunch when someone bought like a helicopter that they were building, like to the lunch table. And I thought that doesn't happen like everywhere. Nice. I still have that picture. And I was just like glazing over and trying to see. That's what they were talking over lunch. Look away, I'm like, it's their gizmo, like I'm building it here. Like how would it probably? Another memorable, moments are all the posters and the stuff that they would have like outside the elevators, outside the labs. And you could really feel that innovation is heroic. They would have a lot of I'm an innovator days, innovation contests, T-shirts, like photos of them encouraging teenagers and high schools and like inspiring others. So a lot of the innovation is a big part of the culture that you feel in that sense through the artifacts, through the photos, through the posters. So that's something that is definitely felt. But of course, it's a big organization. People are working with their computers in their rooms. Like, it's not that people are all the time outside and like building helicopters. But you do get to have these like amazing experiences. I got to drive a lunar rover.
Whoa.
Yeah. All this fun stuff that will never get into an academic paper because it's meaningless for management theory, but it's so cool for me. Like I felt,
that's amazing.
And it just happened. I went outside and it's not that it was so planned. I got to see Robonaut 2 before it was launched. I got to talk to the last shuttle gathering for family and friends from the astronauts that returned from the last shuttle. So they had these gatherings that like they share basically after they returned the week after immediately to family and friends. Like, how did it feel? How was the experience? So I got there. So you do feel that you are a part of something special. And it's also, these are special people. They come from all over. They dedicate their life to really study hard and be experts in whatever they do. And try to do something that is better, that is different for humanity, to explore space. It's not something mundane or something clear. It's not necessarily the most lucrative thing that they could have done, many of them. When you get to know them, and it's interesting. And of course, not everything is exciting. And as I'm telling you, you asked me to pick those memorable moments, right? So it's not that every day there is that exciting, but overall, I have a lot of these good memories, but a lot of meetings that I'm like really squinting my eyes and trying to say, what are they saying? Exactly. You need to read a lot of articles and spend a lot of hours to understand their discipline and their world. So it's not, just fun.
I have a theory that certain places you only end up in if you really have a passion, and those places have just a different culture by definition, because everyone who's there is doing it for love of doing it. And one thing that comes to mind is like my religious studies program, like master's program. Nobody studies religious studies
Yeah.
for the money or for like because they need it for their profession. You have to be a weird, curious person who wants to understand how people move around and think about the world and what's in other people's minds and how did all of this happen. And yeah, whenever I walk into this place, you can feel it. Like you can feel it in the air. There's nobody here, or there's most people here are here for the right reasons, and that
I hope
matters
so. I don't know
lot.
if it stays if it's like sustainable. That's the only thing. I think it does, because as humans, I think we change, and whatever was exciting for us, let's say in our 20s or in our 30s or at a certain moment in life, after 2, 3, 4, 5 years, often changes its meaning. So not for all of us, but at least many of us, and especially people who are drawn by intellectual curiosity, I think it is very hard to sustain the same place or to be as passionate about the same thing for a long time. So it could stay in the culture, though. People can come and go, but it could stay in the culture.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I never stayed 5 years
in any place,
so
exactly.
I wouldn't know.
Yes.
But cool. Yeah. So I think you had this 3-year study of NASA as they experimented with this open innovation idea. So I'd love to hear, what was the experience like? What did you study exactly and what you learned from it?
Definitely. So the experiment was very brave in that sense. Still, many companies do not do that, though I think they should, especially today. Now with remote, it's becoming easier. They basically took their strategy plan for that year and the most strategic project that they know that they're stuck on, that they will, if they will be able to solve, that would be a big leap, that will make something different. Things that require R&D. And said, for 1 year, we'll try to solve them in the best way we know, internally, externally with collaborators, contractors, but we'll also post them for anyone to solve through open innovation, crowdsourcing, online platforms and communities. Why not? They heard about this idea. They said, why not? Let's try it. These are hard problems. If you think about it, why not? There are many reasons why not. Why isn't everyone doing it? Why aren't all organizations doing it? Because you can think why. Many organizations are scared of opening the things that they're working on. They ask legal, how can we do it? There are many reasons why not. But to be honest, after doing so many workshops around open innovation with so many companies and managers, I can tell you that a lot of those reasons are more psychological than business or R&D wise. It's more, this is how we are used to doing the thing, and it's a fear of change. So because they are led by a science culture, they thought about it as experimentation. We should experiment with our process. We should innovate the way we innovate. And that's what I think many managers also should embrace, that experimental way of thinking about their management processes and innovation processes in particular. This was an experiment designed for a year, but it didn't require a year, because after 3 months, already results started coming in from people online. And some of the results were really surprising for the NASA folks, for the experts. Especially one of them that became known as the home run of that experiment, which is around predicting solar flares, solar storms. And this is something that the Hila physics and at NASA and beyond NASA knew that it is a hard problem for a decade. It's hard to predict in 24 hours if a solar storm is going to happen or not. It has major implications for radiation, for people, for craft, for everything that is in space, and also for aviation and other things that are in space, for satellites, etc. And a semi-retired radio engineer from rural New Hampshire was able to build a model in those 3 months that really had amazing performance. So the NASA heliophysics expert and radiation expert tested it. It's not just, I have an idea. He had an idea, but he developed a whole model with an algorithm, and they tested it on the machines, and they saw that it really produces great results. So that completely changed how things went. So from that moment, it created a lot of heat in the organization, because so far it was just an experiment. And that's something that they're used to. But all of a sudden now it also sometimes works, right? So some people were like really excited about it and said, okay, wow, this thing works. We should do more of this, and how and why. And others were like, wait a minute. What do you mean that every time now that we have a challenge, we'll just put it outside for anyone to solve? So why are we here? What's the point? Remember, these are people that came especially and dedicated all their years in life. So when I asked them about open innovation, and I was there to study new ways of organizing for innovation and how they impact their knowledge work, all of a sudden they started talking to me about themselves and how they were trained and how this is an anathema to the way they were trained. And this goes against the way they were mentored and the scientific methods. And it's like cheating. Every time you have a problem to post it for someone else to solve. What's the point? Like, I'm a scientist, I'm an engineer, this is what I'm here for. So it became a deeper issue. So what I thought originally and what many management theories thought and scholars wrote about was, how do you design your process? But we didn't realize until this study that it was something very deep that has to do with their professional identity of who they are as innovators, as problem solvers. So in this study, I basically was able to see that it's not enough to talk about changing your process. You have to really transform how you think about yourself if you want to adopt open innovation and dismantle your knowledge boundaries. So what I saw, and this is why it was important for me to stay there for a long time, because if usually the studies end up after the experiment, and then I would say, oh, great success, innovation happened. But I stayed for 2 more years and kept on tracking what happened, and I could see the difference that some scientists and engineers decided to adopt it, but that required this deeper transformation of themselves, of their work processes, of how they think about it, while others rejected it. Even if they said they were doing it for management's sake, and they were maybe doing it, they didn't really use it. So that's what the study shows, these fragmentation, these divergent reactions, that you can have people in the same lab even. It's not about how they're trained. It's not about other things that many people think sometimes. Maybe if you're a scientist or an engineer, some people in the same lab could be really against it or really for it. And it had to do with deeper reasons around their professional identity and how they were trained and how they're able to shift it. I call it professional identity refocusing work, because those that decided to dismantle their boundaries, their knowledge boundaries, and really change the way they work, had to zoom out of the way they think about themselves and really refocus it on from the how they do the work to the why, to ask themselves, okay, and they started talking like, this is about, science is about finding truth. I want to get to Mars. Who cares who solves it? Like, we shouldn't be thinking about ourselves as the problem solvers. Forget about how we're doing it. Like, we have a bigger why. Let's focus on that. And maybe we can get there if we change the how. So this ability to detach yourself from how you're doing things is very hard. But this transformation is fascinating. So that's the new part that I told you, that you go into the field and you try to understand what's new theoretically and what's not. So I would say rejection, unfortunately, of new things is old theoretically. We know that people hate change. So those people that rejected it for different reasons, unfortunately, was known. But the fact that you can have both rejection but also adoption, and that it has to do with those deeper reasons, was not known in the literature until this study. And that led to many different organizations listening to these outcomes and the results of this study, and then talking to their people and the managers. There was this disconnect between the managers that said, do this open innovation, embrace crowdsourcing, it's cool, it's fast, it's cheap. And the scientists and the engineers who are like, just are not connected to it. Like, they don't want to do things because it's fast or cheap. Like, it has to speak to them. So those that were able to really connect to it and say, I believe in this, I think it can enhance my capabilities, I can see this change empowering, I can see this transforming for the good, they adopted it. Those that didn't told their managers, sure, but it never really got implemented. And I see it again and again in companies that disconnect, unfortunately.
Interesting. And it's interesting that it comes down to identity, because I'm involved in Buddhist philosophy and wrote my thesis on Buddhist philosophy. And Buddhist philosophy deals a whole lot with the dangers of a rigid identity. And a lot of the meditation techniques, if you dig deeper into why are we even meditating, why are we doing this, it's to come in direct contact with the constructed nature of identity and how it's made up, and you can change it and understand how malleable it is. And so it's really interesting to hear that. It's this cognitive flexibility, in an innovation,
we call it. Yes. So we call it cognitive flexibility, exactly this malleable nature that you're talking about, this ability of some professionals to really change how they think. about themselves, to be able to detach, to shift, to transform. The one thing I did see that can explain the difference between the people that were able to do that, so I don't have information about their meditation habits, but I could see that there was a difference in the way they were trained over the years. And so I went all the way to look into their history. And because many people kept on asking me, how do you explain that some people were able and some were not? Is it science versus engineering, men versus women? No. This PhD versus that? No. Tenure? No. Age? No. So what is it? So I don't think there's one thing. We are complex, dynamic human beings. But I do think the way we are trained and what we do in our life matters. So what I found is those that had this cognitive flexibility and the ability to refocus their professional identity and transform were the ones that moved between disciplines and domains over the years. And the ones that did not, on average, I'm talking about, grew up vertically in that sense, in the same discipline, in the same domain. So I think it explains the ability to detach yourself or not. Because if you grow up thinking in one domain and getting used to the way a domain or a discipline thinks, even if you move between organizations, but you work in, let's say, in the same food chemistry, it could be in a big company, it could be in a small one, but it gets into you the way a specific discipline thinks, the way it works. And then you start thinking that this, how you do the work is the important thing. And now I'm seeing it also, by the way, with AI. Like every time that you have a big change, a new technology that is trying to disrupt the way you work and requires you to detach from the how you do your work, it's very hard. Even though in the beginning, when you go to school, maybe you think, if you're a doctor, you think you want to heal people and save people. If you're a lawyer, you think about justice. But over the years, when you start practicing your profession, most people get attached to the how. And then when the how get disrupted, all of a sudden, you mean, I'm not going to just sit and write a paper. I can put it on crowdsourcing platform. Wait a minute. You think it's against what you believe? Not necessarily. But it's just because you've been trained and you've been doing it for so many years that you think this is the important thing. Not necessarily.
I recently heard a lot of talk about openness to experience as something that might be, to new experiences, might be something that's even genetic.
There is a personality trait. There are big studies in psychology around personality traits. Some people really believe those studies. There are even people that believe that you can use a lot of computational techniques to try to understand them and that they predict. So that's why I said I think what I found, for instance, is one out of the factors. Of course, there are personality traits that come into it. I personally believe that personality traits explain, maybe if you think about it like a painting, right? It explains like the big brush. It doesn't explain the small brushes and the nuances of the painting. So it can explain the big brush, like some cultures are like this, some people are like that. But I think what you do with your life really explains the beautiful painting, let's say in your specific painting. In that sense, I think I have a friend that just wrote about it recently. I was surprised. I was him in my PhD, and he's a very introvert, shy person, and he got this teaching award. And he told me and in this interview that he wrote his students, I'm an introvert, but it doesn't mean that I have to, how did he say it? Surrender to my character or something like because when you teach, you have to be like outgoing and to engage. And I love that, that he felt, okay, I know this is who I am and this is how I was grown, but I can also try different things. I can, push myself out of my comfort zone. So I think it does explain a big part, but we shouldn't stop there with personality or genetics. To think like our life experiences, what we make of it, and what we do really changes how we behave and who we are. Not for everyone, but I think for the type of people that I study that are usually highly educated, they have this drive to grow. I think there is more to it than just how they were born or the way their personality trait, like to believe that it doesn't change. So I try and that's also something we have control over. So if we just think that we are married to those personality traits that maybe in the age of 20, in some like job evaluation, psychometric they gave us, and we saw that this is who we are, if we just keep ourselves to it, I think it's very constraining. It could be a self-fulfilling prophecy that we don't really want.
Exactly, right? That's the other possibility that to consider is like this growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. This is also something that a lot of people write about.
Yeah, I believe in it. I truly do. I teach it. I educate with it. I really believe in that growth mindset. Yeah. And I think it's not that I believe that it's possible for everyone and that we constantly grow, but I think it's a productive mindset to have. Maybe we won't get there, but at least it's better than saying, this is who I am or this is how things should be. Like, so we should try at least.
This relates to design thinking and design approaches also, because actually the last conversation I had in the last episode that came out was with Dave Evans, who's at the design school at Stanford. And he said one thing that's rarely discussed is every designer believes through sheer faith that if they continue to engage with the problem and try different things, they'll eventually solve it. If you don't have that belief that you can do it, then you don't do it and you won't succeed for sure. Yeah. And it definitely resonated with me from in my personal life. It's like I come to a project, I have no idea that there is a solution or that I will find it, but I act like I'm 100% sure that I will solve it, because that's the only way to actually solve it.
I agree. Or if you would stand aside and look at it and say, oh, maybe it's an unsolvable problem. That will make you think completely different, right? You will lose half of your motivation and half of your ideas in your head. You will build them up before you even start thinking about them. So that's why I think some of these mindsets are helpful, even if we don't execute upon them or completely. But we may. And this maybe could be a lot, especially if it's something that we want to change in a specific profession. So for scientists or engineers who want to work differently, who not necessarily think they want to be the one solving all their problems, they want to orchestrate solutions from all over, from labs, from collaborators, from people online. And you can see it now with COVID. There are major problems that we need to think differently about the way we have been doing science and engineering and R&D. Like, it cannot be that we just leave all these important problems for experts with those traditional methods and ways of organizing that are the same for hundreds of years. So we are seeing change. It's not as fast as I was hoping in the beginning of this crisis, but we are seeing change in the way companies and organizations are moving. It could be more. Definitely. With the tools that we have today and the technologies that we have today, they are not stopping us. What is stopping us is culture, power, politics, identity, many other things, but not technology.
That's what shocked me when I heard that Moderna had essentially the same vaccine that we have now, 2 days after they got the sample, which was well before anyone in the US even died of it, like super early. It took them 2 days to synthesize a vaccine. And then now, it was like a year later, we're just starting to give it to people. Yeah. And I'm sure there's some testing you have to do. But
but I would say it's an example of many other things. So vaccine have to be like, it's something that has to be carefully tested, of course. But there are many other inventions that happened in this period that we've never heard of. How many new chemical materials that people saw that, like, you can put on a handle or in an elevator and it will completely, for instance, prevent any growth of any microorganism, any virus. There have been materials like this year, but they have not been commercialized yet or nothing. Like, you haven't seen anything. I haven't seen, like in airplanes.
Never heard of it.
You can imagine in airplanes how amazing it would be if we would have a completely different ventilation system, for instance, or in big buildings. There are technologies, but it's very slow. So the transition from that idea to the full execution, that's the hard part where many good things die. Yeah, this reminds me of something I keep going to that Aristotle said, which he gives me hope, but it also explains a lot of things. Is like that evil is just the absence of good. It's not anything specific. So the reason why these things haven't been commercialized is because nobody good came in and commercialized them, or nobody, like, there's only so much good in the world, and it prioritizes, and then some things just never happen because there wasn't anyone to do it. I don't know if I agree with that. That could be simplifying it. No, I think I think that goes to that heroic thinking about innovation, which is beautiful, but also not necessarily realistic. So I don't think it's about good or bad. I think it's about disadvantages and weaknesses of the system and organizations and the way things run, which could be done differently. And some of it is more economic reasons and incentives, and some of it is ignorance of us as consumers, the ability that we could have to influence, and the fact that we drink the Kool-Aid of whoever tells us what's the right thing to do at a certain point, of the companies, basically. So I think it's more nuanced than that. I like the quote, but I think to explain why we don't see all these technologies that we could have seen this year, that's not enough. I almost feel that's a whole different podcast section, I would say, if we ever want to talk about from idea to execution.
Yeah, for sure.
Why is it failing? How come all these great ideas are not becoming a reality? Yes, many people are afraid of investing in this period. There are like at least 5 different reasons I could map that are good people and good intentions, but that are creating this failure that we are now in, I would say. You could think of so many creative solutions to solve some of the problems we are facing, even beyond the vaccines and drugs, which are like the hardcore, let's say, that you require experts. But a lot of the other problems, right, for business, for new business strategy, for a lot of those technologies could happen. It's just that we're not used to doing changes so fast and to innovating so fast. The innovation system is very slow. It grinds slowly. It moves slowly. And even with a crisis, as you said, that is really an impetus for change, still it's moving slow.
And I think that's what I meant. So when I think of this quote, I don't mean good people versus bad people. What I mean is like functional. And so the reason these systems were dysfunctional was because they weren't functional. Nobody at a previous time built a functional system to do this, and therefore it's dysfunctional. And in a sense, the same thing with, I think most of the suffering in the world today, it's not that there's someone evil trying to cause harm. It's that nobody built the right function to do the right thing. And so it's not there. So which for me is both hopeful and It
is both. I can see how it's simultaneously optimistic and pessimistic.
Yeah.
Definitely. But ask me about things that I know, like around innovation. I can't talk about good and evil in the world. That's like way over my head.
It's a kind of function. It's a kind of function.
That's hard. So, these days, it's hard to talk about good and bad. Yes.
So bringing it into innovation, which was going to be my next question anyway, is you talk about, which I really love, one of your articles about embracing a little chaos for innovation, allowing certain amount of chaos.
Yes.
So something about order and chaos that is interesting. If you can unpack that for me, I think that would be super interesting.
So after doing the NASA study that I told you about, I did a different study a few years after, completely different, in contrast of spending 3 years in one organization and seeing the long transformation. I spent 3 days in hackathons every time. And for a year, I moved between hackathons and makeathons. And I tried to understand how it works, because it's a phenomenon that we are all aware of. And I think many of us have participated, at least in one hackathon of a kind. But we don't know a lot about them besides, I would say, from an academic perspective, besides the popular press that can tell you this is great, this is how you should do it. We don't really know like when it works, when it doesn't, how, what. So it's a lot of knowledge that is out there with practitioners and with people who are leading it. But we cannot teach it. We don't know whether it's working or not for managers, for companies. And many people will say that it has lost its meaning, even that it's become like this fad, and that people they call everything now a hackathon. So it doesn't mean anything. It's like diluted.
As long as there's pizza.
Exactly. Let's like hack this, let's hack that. Like it's hackathon session. Like they call 4 hours of brainstorming. It's a hackathon. So if everything is a hackathon, what is a hackathon? So for a year, I spent, all these 3 days hackathons or 2 days hackathons. And then I said, okay, what's interesting here? What's new here? What should I study? And then one of the things that I felt were interesting was this compacting, accelerating process that happens to some of the new product development processes that I could see. And I focused specifically around assistive technology. So medical device, assistive technology that can help people with different disabilities, diseases, that I found amazing that in 3 days, like new products were built from nothing, like from people that just they met a specific person, a user, a potential user that has a problem. And in 3 days, there was a prototype almost, ready to be used, or in some cases, if it could be used in a day or two, if you just polish it a little bit. So I said, wait a minute, this is fascinating. And then I decided to study it in a rigorous fashion. So I compared similar hackathons, similar projects, 13 of them, and I had a research associate in each of those teams, kind of taking minute by minute and really photos, videos, really trying to understand and unpack the process. And in the end of the day, we wanted to understand how can we explain this magic, like that those teams are able to do it in these 3 days, and how can more teams do it if it's possible. The technology seems to be enabling us to do things faster today. We have better, faster 3D printers. We have Raspberry Pi, Arduino, like all these new fun tools that were not there. But our processes and the way we think and the way we work are not necessarily there. That's one of the things that I've seen. So you could see that even if you have these technologies, it's not enough. So I studied this for a while. And when I compared and analyzed the differences between those teams that were able to produce a working prototype in the end of 3 days versus those that did not, I saw this thing around order and chaos that you brought up. So the teams that did and followed the best practices that are more organized and had more order are actually the one that failed. So what we found out that and for me as a business school teacher, it's something very profound to understand that the thing that we are teaching could also be wrong in a deep way, in the sense that it doesn't work under these conditions. So we usually teach the teams need to coordinate well, to understand each other, to build a clear plan for what they should do, especially when it's under time pressure, right? So the natural tendency of human beings is when you have time pressure or stress is to try to stick to order, to try to to clarity, to know what you're doing. It's very hard when you're under stress to try to think creatively, to all of a sudden think outside of the box. Like our natural tendency is under stress to, it's called cognitive closure. And there's been a lot of research about that. So I was trying to understand how come those teams are not put into this trap of this cognitive closure, of this failure. It's called creativity under the gun. And it fails, when you put creativity under the gun. But not always, right? We have all these amazing stories that you actually put things under time pressure and you do get these creative solutions. So I tried to tease out what was different in those projects, in those teams. And one of the things that I saw is that they were not expecting any order, any best practice, any clear process to follow. So they were embracing the chaos on a very deep level. So to give you an example of one of these aha moments that I had, there was a person in one of the teams that I was a part of. I was doing participant observation. I was kind of part of the team, but not really doing everything, mostly studying them. And there was a moment that she didn't know what to use. And there were two different potential engines she was looking at. And these are hardware projects. And I asked her, what do you think? And she looked at me I'm gonna try both. She didn't even understand, why would I even stop for a second to think which one is gonna work better? Right. She has no idea. And all she's trying to do is to test and test and test. And this hyper experimental mindset, I would say, where you don't think there is any chance you're gonna know what is gonna work. And it's very hard to do when you're under time pressure and with new people. So that was it's easy to do experimental when you're in a Google or in a place that gives you the affordance and the time and the money to now just experiment about it. But when you just met people that you don't know, you have to find a way to work well together. And you only have 3 days and there is a really user that is really in need for this. So it creates also this kind of emotional pressure. It's very hard to then not to try to plan, not to try to put some order to the process. But it is a trap. So I would say every time that teams run into new conditions of, on one hand, a creative task, like a new product development or new product design, on the other hand, extreme time pressure, you You have to work against that natural tendency to bring order, to bring your best practices. So what we saw in the other teams that brought order, what do I mean by order? These were engineers and computer scientists and designers and others from the best companies. And they basically brought a lot of the agile, the scrum, a lot of the methods that we use, and they just compacted them and condensed them and tried to do them faster. So for instance, in one of those teams, someone said, okay, let's just do, instead of the once a day meeting, we'll do it once every 2 hours. They tried to bring order and to do the same thing that they're used to doing in a week, now in 3 days, or in a month, in 3 days. It makes a lot of sense when you think about it, but it just doesn't work. These processes are not built for this extreme time pressure. What we saw is they almost spent too much time on the process, on coordinating well, on understanding each other, on discussing. And then it ate that experimentation time, but it's not just time, it made them attached to that solution that they already convinced themselves that was good. So they spend, let's say, and it's not a lot of hours. If you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. You just met a few people, like you got to talk to them and decide what you're going to do before you're going to start working about it. But the question is like how deep you talk about it, to which level you agree. So what we found that was working, and we call it this more chaotic way, we call it minimal and adaptive coordination. So it's very minimal. They only agreed about the rough direction. It's almost that you're going to build a puzzle, and one team was really trying to get a sense of that picture. They even had measurements. Those that wanted order, they had measurement of what type of material they would use. In the article, we really specified was around materials, measures, kind of the functions, like really like we teach. You're going to build a new product, start sketching, right? Get us a plan and then divide the labor. That's what they did, the regular teams that were organized. But those teams that were more chaotic, they just said more or less the direction. It's like a puzzle of a dog, like not what type of dog, like it's very like high level, okay? And they ran for it and they split even sometimes, and they worked not in good communication and not in good coordination, but they constantly experimented. And that was the minimal part. The adaptive part is that they started adapting to each other. So they had this swift communication and like swift check-ins, quickly looking into each other. Okay, and many times they would find mistakes because they didn't coordinate well, right? So they were not a well-oiled machine. Many of these team members, after we talked to them and they said, if you would ask me how we communicated, like I would give us like a -4. Like they didn't even, sometimes half a day went by, they didn't even know each other's names. Like they were so much into the doing and into the testing and experiment that they were not even like looking at each other, not even sure who's in the team, who's not. They're just like running for it before they even know where they're running to. But this chaos really helped them, because after a while they experimented fast and they failed fast, as we know, and then they started adjusting with each other. So the best teams were there that not only did minimal, because some of these minimal coordination team indeed were able to build a product, but it was very basically, because they split many of these teams. They didn't really work as a team. They only did minimal. They brought some ideas. But the minimal and adaptive, they started minimal, but slowly they coordinated. So it's almost the opposite from what we teach in that sense. Instead of start with the team, talk to each other, know what you're doing, and then split, it's almost the opposite. Get a quick sense, don't spend more than an hour, run, start, split, run, don't coordinate for a while. Get all the ideas and the directions out of the system, try them out quickly, and then start coordinating and gradually build it. But don't coordinate in the regular way of now we're going to discuss and convince each other, because you're not. You just met these people, you think differently from them. You're not going to be able to convince. So find a way to work together and adjust and get to an agreed upon solution that really works, and test as much as you can. So I would say that minimal and adaptive coordination is a bit of the opposite of what we teach, but under extreme conditions of ambiguity and new time pressure, that's important to embrace.
Really interesting. In the world of design and design thinking, there's a principle bias towards action, which sounds very similar, where you don't perfect the plan, you don't plan, you don't perfect, you learn through the doing.
Definitely. And it's hard to do it when it's people you just met. I think that's the hard part, when and a lot of Companies are now doing what we call in the literature teaming. There's a book of Amy Edmondson that I recommend. It's about teaming. So if you know your team members, you don't need this because you're well coordinated. So everything that I'm saying is about specific conditions of extreme conditions that we are facing now. Many times you go into a new team, you don't know each other. It's a new challenge. You don't know the challenge. You've never worked together, and it's an extreme time pressure. If you have the time, all the time in the world to get to know each other, of course, it's much more fun to get to know each other. If these are people you worked for years, you don't need to do this minimal and adaptive coordination. You can have a bias for doing each other. That's fun. But if you're getting to this new situation, that's where you need to embrace the chaos and not try to bring the order. But even though that's the first thing I think that many people and good engineers and good designers, and we've seen that, wanted to do, because that's the tools that they have in their toolkit. That's what they know. Yeah. It's about throwing the tools. It's like leaving them behind when you go into these new conditions. Leave them at the door. Don't think they're going to work. New conditions require new tools, new processes. And I think that's also part of what's really hard now with COVID, right? We have completely new conditions, and they create a lot of ambiguity and a lot of personal stress. And then we want to cling to what we know, even if it doesn't work. We try to squeeze it into, even about what we said in the beginning of the conversation, the remote versus not. Like the nature of work has not changed yet, which is stupid, because it should. Like, right, the world has changed everything. So we do it in Zoom, but we assume it's going to be the same type of work. That doesn't make sense. Like, we got to change the work processes themselves. Like, we cannot use the same tools and the same process when the conditions are so fundamentally different.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about the remote work and what you've seen in terms of how things should change. Are there any new thoughts, new experiments that are exciting, new directions?
So remote work, to begin with, I have bad news in that sense when it comes to creativity. So I'm not going to be the one that is going to say, I love working remotely personally, right? It's fun. But for creativity, I can work. I have a new dress code that I invented. I don't know if you heard of. I'm joking, but it's like business casual.
Pajamas.
It's PJ casual, yeah. You can be like PJ business, so like I'm half business and like half pajamas. Like it's a lot of fun, right? There are a lot of good things about working remotely. But for creativity, it goes up to a certain point. So I would say it's great for the first phase of each person thinking alone. Maybe it can contradict the groupthink biases and problems that we have in organizations. But at some point, you want for this experimentation to happen in a team, you need this cumulative interaction that one builds on each other, right? This recombination of ideas. What is innovation? Is recombination of ideas that exist already in one domain, but you put it in a different way in another domain. So it's not about just thinking in yourself in your home until you get this aha moment. A lot of it is about recombining and retalking. And how can you do it in this sterile environment? So I would say a few things are missing. First is the physical stimulation. It's very sterile. So I recommend to many managers that do product design to rethink the physical work environment of their employees, to send them VR headsets, to play with gizmos, to bring their kids toys, like to change their work environment. Like I recommend people to take their laptops to work outside, to work if they can on a lake or whatever, like to change with it. We are creatures that are impacted by our physical environment, right? That's why maker spaces are so much fun and everyone loves playing with the machines. When you experiment, it's something tactical. You experiment with an environment. So I would say that's the easy part. Let's say that's solved. Let's say managers get it, that they can't just expect people to sit in their bedrooms and to be creative in their bedrooms for a year almost now, right? And to be as creative as they were before. I would say the harder part is the working process. So everything that I told you about, the magic that happened in those teams, had to do with the visible workflow that people had. They could see each other. They could adjust to each other because they could literally see, and if not, ask the person for a second. And what happens now with many of these remote teams, they don't see the work process. Maybe we see each other, but we're not co-creating something together. So we have better and better tools today, but they are even not always used to work together. So let's say the basic level is, of course, if you're writing code or if you're developing something, you're writing something together, there are a lot of collaborative tools. But we need to be much more thoughtful about how to keep those tools and to share with each other dirty work, not to wait until it's perfect. So what's happening now, I would say the failure that I see in a lot of these remote teams, people just met, it's new teams, they want to do a new design sprint, a new hackathon, a new challenge. They try to impress each other as much as they can online. So a lot of the failure that I see, that they are afraid of showing work in process, basically. And everything that has to do with experimentation is about this visible workflow that you're able to see what the other person is doing, to build upon it, to try to. And if you are afraid of sharing, and oftentimes either afraid or just you don't, because it's like remote, it's in your notebook, it's in your laptop, and you're just on Zoom, like it's not shared. So what I warmly recommend to teams these days is to work constantly open. Open cameras may get creepy, so maybe just if you're like doing a hackathon for 2 days or something, to keep them open. But open work and shared work documents, work artifacts, constantly, that whichever time of the day the other person did something, you immediately see it and you can respond to it. Otherwise, it becomes sterile, and we don't see that like cumulative knowledge building on each other, and definitely not creativity. And the time zone is a different thing to play with, and how to leverage it. So that's, I would say, the third thing that I see taking place is the time zone. And there are interesting dynamics around it. It's not obvious how to play with it. And those teams that are able to leverage it and to almost look at it as a ball that they pass between each other, and they find a way that some are like overlapping and some are like in different time zones are working, that's great. But others are just falling between the time zone cracks.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've worked across time zones most of my life. And some teams it works beautifully. Like you come in the morning and your work is ready because the other team just prepared everything for you, and then you have your whole day to do your work. And when they come in the morning, their job is ready for them. If you can do that's wonderful. Like you're essentially working almost 24/7 without any it's nobody's waiting for anybody ever. But if you miss it, it could be the opposite. It could be compounded. It could be compounded
there's
waiting.
Miscommunication, and you're doing something, it's not what they meant. And so I would say you have to invest way more in coordination and communication, in remote work, and in open shared documents. So I do not recommend managers to try online hackathons unless they have to with new teams these days. It's not something like a lot of people did it in the beginning of COVID because that seemed the most natural thing. But it took a while to understand it's really hard to do. Like it's very hard to work well. And the teams that we saw, for instance, in the EU versus virus, the teams that were better, were teams that already knew each other. It is too much to expect new people that just met each other to do it online on a new challenge. It's a bit too much sometimes. So it does work better for teams that know each other already and have the coordination part and the communication part checked.
Yeah, interesting. And we definitely, when we do sprints, then we use certain tools like Figma that allows everyone, it's a design tool that allows everyone to see what everybody else is designing in real time. So I can come in and my designer could be working on a screen and I fix a typo or I do something.
That's so important.
And that works remotely too. So surprisingly, when we do sprints that are semi-remote, we sometimes have maybe 2 people in a room and the rest of distributed. So we have Zoom open for the entire day, and we have Figma open for the entire day. And so we can jump in, say something, fix something. And
open cameras is very important. Yes, open cameras, as I said, if it's for a limited time, a day, 2, even 3, a week feels very weird to have open cameras in someone's home the whole time. But a day or 2, or even like a whole weekend, like a hackathon, I think is a great, it feels weird. And for some people, it may feel too intrusive. But if you want to feel that you're constantly, because some of these things come up to you when you're like, okay, 1 second. Like it's not when you're just talking for 2 hours. It's in between and when you're going. And then also things start flowing. There is a different flow and we still haven't figured it out. So this is based on, as I said, my observation. I haven't done a rigorous study of it yet. I think we will see a lot of studies on remote teamwork soon and remote work in general. And it's going to be mixed results, dependent on many variables that we haven't cracked it yet. But this is what I can recommend based on the online hackathons that I've been participating in.
Interesting. I have 2 remaining questions for you.
Sure.
One is about the role of the manager and how you see it changing both with the digital transformation, with remote, and also just to create better innovation. How is the traditional role of a manager changing? Do we even need managers? What's your perception on that?
That's a great question. So I have this piece with at the MIT Sloan Review that talks about the balance between autonomy and control. And by the way, all the hackathon studies were done with Sarah Leibovich and Lior Zalmanson. And also this piece that I'm talking to about now is written in collaboration with the two of them. And Lior specifically is someone that brought that metaphor around theater versus cinema. So we were trying to think about how do managers manage innovation in a way that really brings more autonomy to the people? Because in many companies today, employees, designers, engineers, they want more autonomy. And we know autonomy is great for creativity. But managers, on the other hand, are getting more and more pressure on control, on performance, on results. They can't just sit back and say, okay, let's assume you guys be creative. I'll wait another month, I'll wait. So how do they make sure it's going to the right direction without putting that pressure, without killing that autonomy of their employees? So we started thinking about all the different managerial styles and what we've seen in managers of hackathons. Here, I'm talking about a study that I conducted, the first one that I told it for a year. I moved between different hackathons and makeathons, and I talked to the hackathon organizers and tried to see how they work and how is it similar or different from what I know from regular organizational and traditional managers of innovation. And I saw that they do work differently because in hackathons, no way they're going to tell people what to do. Like that goes against the ethos of the hackathon. So a manager can come and tell the employees, but you're coming for 3 days volunteering, giving your time. Right. No hackathon organizer is going to tell you what to do. So the hackathon organizers take it as a given. The autonomy is, of course, it's all about autonomy. It's all about creativity. I want to let people do what they want. But still, also the hackathon organizers want to have something productive in the end, to show investors, to show the judges, to show the people the sponsors, for the people themselves, for the participants. They want this to be successful for themselves. So how do they do it? So we interviewed them a lot, watched them. And the secret sauce that we talk about and the metaphor that we use is thinking about a theater director versus a cinema director. So the metaphor is that a cinema director has the ability to control and to micromanage in that sense every minute and how things are going to happen. Versus a theater director knows that once the play starts, it starts. Like they have no control over it. So they really diligently set the stage for the creative art to happen. So that's the metaphor we use in that paper. And we talk about the strategies that the hackathon organizers, basically how they manage innovation by setting the stage diligently and correctly. I can give you a few examples of how they do it, and then they go back and they're not on the stage. They let the people, they let the participants, they let the teams do their thing, but there are those nuanced things that they did before and they do throughout that you don't notice almost, but they are there. So they lay the infrastructure, they set the stage for success, for creativity to happen, versus the traditional managers. They put some conditions, but they assume that they will be there to help when things break. So they should be there. Right. That's how they think about their role, like to manage it. And they interfere sometimes and they ruin it. So for instance, and one thing is feedback. So how do you give feedback on ideas? It's very scary to share your idea with the manager, right? And when it's new ideas and we are all doing all these pitches and stuff. So one of the ideas that we saw that hackathon organizers are doing, unlike traditional managers that come into the room and share your ideas, they don't want quick feedback to themselves. What they do, they bring structured questions and guidelines for peer feedback. So they basically create a constructive peer-to-peer environment where peers give feedback to each other, and they listen to it, they are aware of it. But it's not this intimidating manager that we got to show them the best thing we have, but it's building a peer-to-peer feedback and learning environment in a constructive way. So they bring all the principles to begin with. They say when and how often these feedback sessions should happen and the pitches, instead of we'll do whatever we think is right, and at some point we'll have to show it to the manager, and maybe we'll try to push that point because it's not ready yet, and then you have a lot of interesting dynamics that we know. So that's just one, for instance, strategy that we saw that was really diligently setting the stage for creativity to flourish without giving away the autonomy of the people.
Cool. Yeah, the set the stage and step back idea is really, really cool. And then I think in the same article, you talk about knowledge gaps and how to address those. So what is that about?
That's a really interesting thing we also noticed that they were doing. So Everyone loves to learn, and we talked about curiosity. And when you're managing innovation, people want to learn new things. You get smart people that have that drive, but sometimes they're reinventing the wheel. When they feel like they're learning, it has been done and has been tested in another part of your company or in another industry, and it failed. And you don't want them to spend a lot of this time on learning a knowledge that, could fail, but you don't also want to curtail that curiosity and that exploration. So how do you do it? First of all, a lot of these hackathon organizers created this culture of identifying knowledge gap. Instead of assuming that their people should go and pursue and learn everything they don't know, saying, okay, it's great. If there's a knowledge gap, we don't know how to do it, identify it. And they built a whole network of experts before the hackathon that they could just tap on with one phone call. They got to, in one of the hackathons that I was in one phone call, they got to the number 2 autonomous driving, like in Google designer, that could tell them everything about the way that the sound works and identifies technically, instead of trying to learn this whole thing and just quickly ask that person that question that they had. The person gave the answer quickly. Is it reasonable to follow this? And that's it. And there were other hackathons that people spend half a day online studying like this whole new technology and how they should do it. And it's nice, but it's like a waste of time many times. And you don't have that time. And as a manager, you want to make sure they're on the right track. So they basically built that expert network. So it's something that I recommend for managers to build that expert network, but to also create the culture that it's awesome that you're using it. It's not a sign of failure that you don't know something. It's a sign of learning that you're like fast, you're efficient, you have all this network, you have all this connection. Ask the experts in the field, and you'll be surprised how people that work in different companies are happy to help. It's amazing to see how these experts on a weekend, especially when it's for projects that are around things that have a sense of meaning. Let's put it this way. It's not around building a new advertising campaign. Then an expert won't pick up the phone and help you. But when it's around something that is important for society, for individual, or that has a sense of meaning, people are stepping up and willing to help. But that's something that the manager needs to think about in advance, again, to set the stage before. Because otherwise, the people themselves will try to explore it themselves.
Right, to try to solve it themselves.
Yeah.
That's great. And that also resonates with something that Dave Evans said about when he was young, he wanted to be a marine biologist. But he just assumed that he was going to have to figure everything out and then himself. And then years in terms of how to do it and then years later he found that he lived next to one of the biggest laboratories in the world, that he could have literally driven there for 15 minutes. And also his mother knew a lot of people who worked there and all this stuff that he just never used. So that's part of what started his thinking.
Yeah.
But so it's really cool. So I have one final big question for you. And it's a new question I'm experimenting with these days. Alain de Botton, in his TED Talk, defined the difference between a lecture and a sermon. And he said a lecture is a talk that's trying to give you some information, and a sermon is trying to change your life. And so I'm going to give you a little stage for a short sermon to give to a manager at a business who's really thinking, or someone who works with innovation and really is trying to create the right conditions. What is this one lesson that has the potential to change your life if you really take it seriously and understand it?
Only one. Let me think.
So what's the core?
I have one. It's a quote of one of the managers. So I'll start with as I said, I'm a field researcher, so I give great respect to the people that I study and the people that I watch and the people that I learn from. And one of them is they were going through this transformation of thinking about the traditional way of innovating versus open, accelerated innovation. They said, this is such a transformation. It's from, let me make sure I quote it correctly. It's from the lab being my world to all of a sudden the whole world being my lab. So in that sense, people are used to their organization, their lab being their world. Kind of, even if they say they know the whole world, but as you said, that even Evans, right? There is a whole world, and that was even literally close. But with companies and managers, there's a whole world that can innovate with you. Don't bound yourself with the organizational, the professional boundaries that you're used to. So try to break those boundaries and think, how can you redefine your job and orchestrate innovation when you have the whole world for you. So when you're a manager in an organization, there's no need for you today, with the tools and the technologies and the platforms that we have, to limit yourself with the resources, with the experts, with the knowledge that you have in your organization or in your profession. There are online platforms that are with people and experts seeking to solve new challenges. There are new ways to do R&D, there are new ways to do innovation, and they are available. It is that mindset shift that requires you to move from seeing your world as your organization, your company, your division, your directorate, versus seeing the whole world as something that you can actually orchestrate with the people that you have. And I can tell you that I'm seeing it shifting now because of remote work. So that is something that the boundaries are starting to blur. Because if everyone, you're no longer going just physically to your lab or going to your company. So when you were physically in our company, we also start thinking about that as our world. But now when we are in front of a screen, what's the difference if you have someone that is from your company or if you're working with 10 people that are on online labor markets and online open source projects? Is that different? It's not. Maybe it is, but not to the same degree because you are working all of you remotely together in a team. So I've heard about some companies now that one person is the orchestrating the R&D and on their strategic projects, and 1 out of 15 and all the other 14 are from different organizations and they're doing it together remotely, for instance. So I'm not saying all the work has to move to that structure, but we should experiment. Because it can't be that we have all these tools and we're still working in the old way, and things are moving slower than we should and we need them to move. So there's no reason why not to use this special period for good and bad, special to experiment with the way we're working. I was surprised to see, I can say in COVID, I saw examples for this happening. You would be surprised to see how people on GitHub from different countries share data, even if it's medical, they find a way to, without identifying, but they share data on things that in early stages that you wouldn't believe. So researchers in one country, we talked to the Broad Institute in Massachusetts, was able to study things about Korea and Italy that they didn't even think of, but it's because they said, okay, let's think completely open. Not just think about the data that we have and what we know. Let's think about the world right now.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. From more than one perspective. It makes me think of even some lessons in Buddhism, like about what's the boundary of who you are. It's fungible.
Boundaries are definitely fungible and more permeable that we want to acknowledge. Like we keep those boundaries as if they're protecting us. They're not. They're inhibiting us from growth and from knowledge creation.
Amazing. All right. Thank you so much. Thanks, Hila. This was a great conversation, and I think it will help a lot of people think about how to try different things in their organization. So thank you for your time. I appreciate
My
your time.
pleasure. This was fun.
All right, that's it for today. If you enjoyed the podcast and would like to support it, please consider writing a 5-star review in Apple's podcast app or wherever you're listening. It helps many more people discover the podcast and also makes us feel good. Current support for the podcast comes from my own design company, Remake Labs. We run design sprints all over the world, and our goal is to improve outcomes, whether in business or various organizations, through repeated and rapid design interventions. Now, until next time, be well, everyone. See you next week on Remake.